Ethan always thought of himself as a lucky man. Married to Jessica, a woman who could light up any room she walked into, he often joked with friends that he'd won the wife lottery. They lived in a cozy suburban home, the kind with a white picket fence and a yard big enough for summer BBQs. On the outside, their life looked flawless, a classic Instagram-worthy couple. But lately, something felt off. Jessica had become increasingly distant. She'd started taking girls' nights out more often, each one accompanied by a new dress and a little extra makeup. Ethan didn't want to seem paranoid, so he brushed it off at first. "She's just unwinding," he told himself. But the late-night texts, secretive giggles, and her phone that was now practically glued to her hand said otherwise. Ethan wasn't born yesterday. He knew something was up. It all began to click one Saturday morning when Jessica, sipping her almond milk latte, announced she needed a solo weekend retreat. "It's for my mental health," she said with a serene smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ethan nodded, playing along, but inside, his radar was going haywire. A solo retreat? Jessica hated being alone. She couldn't even order takeout without consulting 3 Yelp reviews and texting Ethan for advice. Ethan decided to let it slide, but his gut told him that he just needed proof. Ethan wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. He prided himself on being level-headed, the guy who always thought things through. But as Jessica packed her weekend bag with a suspicious amount of lingerie for a mental health retreat, his instincts screamed louder than ever. Still, he played it cool. "Do you need me to drop you off?" he asked casually, sipping his coffee. No, Jessica replied a little too quickly. "I'll drive myself. It's not far." Not far? She refused to give the location, claiming it was a private boutique spa. Ethan nodded, hiding his smirk behind the mug. "Boutique spa, huh? Sure." As soon as Jessica's car disappeared down the street, Ethan got to work. He wasn't tech-savvy, but he knew enough to use the hidden GPS tracker he'd purchased online, just in case. And this definitely felt like one of those just-in-case moments. Later that evening, Ethan checked the tracker. Unsurprisingly, Jessica wasn't at some tranquil spa. Instead, her car was parked outside a downtown hotel, a nice one, the kind where the lobby smells like citrus and success. Well, Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "Mental health retreat, my ass." The next morning, Ethan kept up his routine like nothing was wrong. He mowed the lawn, waved at the neighbors, and even baked cookies. Okay, fine. He bought them and reheated them in the oven, but still, he needed to act normal, and if Jessica came home to the smell of freshly baked cookies, all the better. That afternoon, Ethan checked the tracker again. Jessica's car was still at the hotel. He couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. Whatever she was doing, she wasn't even trying to hide it. It wasn't until late Sunday evening that Jessica finally came home. She walked through the door with her trademark cheerful grin, carrying a shopping bag from an upscale boutique. "How was the retreat?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. "Oh, amazing," Jessica gushed, setting the bag on the counter. "So relaxing. I feel like a new woman." "I'm glad," Ethan said with a smile so convincing it could have won him an Oscar. Inside, though, he was already planning his next move. Ethan decided it was time to stop playing the waiting game. If Jessica thought she could outsmart him, she clearly didn't know who she was dealing with. Ethan wasn't just going to confront her with a hunch. He needed undeniable proof, the kind that would leave her fumbling for excuses while he sat back and enjoyed the show. Monday morning, after Jessica left for work, Ethan set his plan into motion. Ethan installed a couple of discreet security cameras at home, one in the living room, pointed toward the front door, and another in the bedroom, just in case. He told himself he wasn't being paranoid, just thorough. If Jessica was going to make a fool of him, he wasn't going down without a fight. Ethan had learned the art of patience. If Jessica wanted to play games, he'd let her, just long enough to catch her red-handed. So, when she mentioned her girls' night out on Friday, Ethan decided to tweak his approach. At breakfast that morning, he casually dropped the bait. "Hey, I've got a late meeting tonight," he said between sips of coffee. "Don't wait up for me. It's one of those won't end until midnight kind of things." Jessica's face lit up, but she quickly hid it behind her coffee cup. "Oh, that's perfect. I was thinking of catching up with the girls anyway." "Great," Ethan said, hiding a smirk. "Have fun." Ethan left for work. He drove a few blocks away and parked at a local diner where he could watch the live feed from his hidden cameras. Sure enough, Jessica sprang into action as soon as he was gone. She disappeared into the bedroom, emerging an hour later in a sleek black dress and heels that Ethan hadn't seen in years. She spritzed on perfume, her most expensive bottle, the one she usually reserved for date nights, and took one last glance in the mirror. And then she left. Ethan watched the front door camera feed closely. Less than 2 hours later, Jessica returned, but she wasn't alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man followed her inside, carrying a bottle of wine and looking smug as hell. Jessica laughed as she closed the door behind him, her hand brushing his arm. "Let's see what you're really up to," Ethan muttered, zooming in on the camera feed. The pair made themselves comfortable. The man poured wine while Jessica giggled at his every word, leaning in closer than necessary. They lounged in the living room, talking and laughing as if they were in their own private world. After finishing their drinks, they moved upstairs to the bedroom. Ethan clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay calm. The footage was all he needed. Let them enjoy their little fantasy, for now. Jessica and her lover didn't leave until the early evening. Ethan noted every detail, the time, the body language, and even the smug way the man adjusted his tie as they walked out the door. Jessica waved him off with a coy smile before heading back inside to tidy up. By the time Ethan returned home that night, Jessica was lounging on the couch in her pajamas, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. "Long night?" she asked, barely looking up. "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You wouldn't believe it." Jessica smiled, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Ethan had everything he needed: security footage, GPS logs, and a mountain of righteous anger. But this wasn't just about exposing Jessica. No, Ethan wanted her to feel the full weight of her betrayal, and that required something unforgettable. The idea struck him while he was sipping his morning coffee: Jessica's parents. They were divorced and couldn't stand to be in the same room, but their presence would add just the right amount of tension. Ethan didn't know the full story of why they split, only that Jessica's mother had always seemed evasive about it. Perfect. At dinner earlier in the week, Ethan brought up the idea casually. "Hey, Jess," he said, his tone light. I've been so busy with work, and we haven't had much time to just enjoy ourselves. How about we host a little dinner this weekend? Just us and a couple of close friends. I'll even cook." Jessica paused, clearly caught off guard. "This weekend? Sure, I guess. Who's coming?" "Oh, that's the fun part," Ethan said with a mischievous grin. "It's a surprise." Jessica arched an eyebrow, but eventually shrugged. "All right, as long as you don't burn the kitchen down." "Don't worry," Ethan replied smoothly. "This'll be a night to remember." The next day, Ethan began making calls. Jessica's father was skeptical at first. "A dinner? With her mother there?" he grumbled. "Why would I want to sit in the same room as that woman?" "I understand it's awkward," Ethan admitted, "but I've got something important to share, and it wouldn't feel right without you both here." Jessica's father sighed heavily but eventually relented. "Fine, but this better be worth it." Her mother took a little more convincing. "I don't know, Ethan. Her father, well, let's just say I'd rather not see him." "I get it," Ethan said reassuringly, "but trust me, this is something you'll want to be here for." After some hesitation, she agreed. By Saturday, everything was in place. Ethan spent the morning setting the table, preparing dishes, with a little help from takeout, of course, and ensuring everything looked perfect. Jessica, unaware of the full guest list, was preoccupied with picking out the perfect dress, clearly assuming the surprise was for some mutual friends. When the doorbell rang, Jessica glanced at Ethan. "You're not going to tell me who it is, are you?" "Patience, my dear," Ethan said with a smile, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Jessica opened the door and froze. Standing there, awkwardly avoiding each other's gaze, were her parents. "Mom? Dad?" she stammered, her face draining of color. "What are you doing here?" "Ethan invited us," her father said curtly, stepping inside. Jessica turned to Ethan, her voice a sharp whisper. "What the hell is going on?" "It's a surprise, remember?" Ethan replied, his smile calm and composed. "Now let's not keep everyone waiting." As everyone sat down to dinner, the tension was palpable. Jessica's mother made polite small talk, while her father mostly stared at his plate. Jessica herself fidgeted nervously, shooting Ethan confused and increasingly irritated looks. But Ethan kept his cool, letting the awkwardness simmer. After the meal, Ethan stood, tapping his glass lightly. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady. "I know some of you weren't expecting to see each other, but I wanted this evening to be memorable." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Ethan, what are you doing?" He turned to her, his expression serious now. "Jessica, tonight is about honesty. I have something to share that involves everyone here." The atmosphere was already tense, but Ethan had anticipated this. He leaned back slightly, letting the room stew in the awkward silence after his toast. Then Jessica's father, always one to speak his mind, broke the ice. "I thought this was a party," he grumbled, looking around. "I mean, 4 people? It's more like a family therapy session. Feels a bit awkward." Ethan smiled, ever the picture of calm. "Oh, don't worry, we're not done yet. A couple of guests are running late, but they'll be here soon." Jessica froze. Her eyes darted between Ethan and the door, her mind clearly racing. "Guests?" she asked, her voice tight. "Who did you invite?" Ethan waved her off. "Don't worry, Jess. You'll find out soon enough." Trying to diffuse the growing tension, Ethan turned his attention to Jessica's parents. "You know, I realized I haven't really gotten to know either of you very well. The last time I saw you both was at our wedding." Jessica's mother let out a strained laugh. "Well, that's because we tend to avoid being in the same room," her father snorted. "We've got complicated history. Let's just leave it at that." Ethan tilted his head, genuinely curious now. He hadn't expected the topic to take this turn. Jessica's father then said, "Let's better focus on what you wanted to tell us all about honesty." Jessica shifted nervously as Ethan stood, grabbing the remote from the coffee table. "Speaking of honesty," he continued, turning toward the TV, "I want to share something with everyone here, something I stumbled upon recently." He pressed play. The room fell silent as the footage began. Jessica and her lover appeared on screen, walking into the house. The man's hand lingered on her back as they shared a laugh, then disappeared into the living room. The video skipped ahead, showing them walking up the stairs together. Jessica's face turned crimson. She stared at the screen, her breathing quickening as the seconds ticked by. Her father was the first to react, groaning audibly and burying his face in his hands. "Oh God, why?" he muttered. "Why me? First, a cheating wife, now a cheating daughter? Is this some kind of cosmic joke?" Jessica's mother scoffed loudly, crossing her arms. "Oh, give me a break. You men are all the same, acting like saints when you're just as flawed. Maybe if you weren't so paranoid and controlling, women wouldn't feel the need to find freedom elsewhere." "Freedom?" Jessica's father shot back, his voice rising. "Cheating is not freedom, Lorraine. It's selfish, destructive, and humiliating. And yet, here we are," Lorraine spat, gesturing to the screen. Meanwhile, Jessica was sinking deeper into her chair, her hands shaking. "Ethan, I can explain," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Oh, I'd love to hear it," Ethan said, his tone sharp with sarcasm. "But before you start, maybe someone can help me out here. Who is this guy?" He pointed at the screen. "Anyone know him? Is this just a fling, or is he, I don't know, part of the family now?" Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her father, now fully enraged, stood up and pointed a trembling finger at her. "You've disgraced this family," he bellowed. "Do you know what I went through with your mother? And now this? How could you do this, Jessica?" Jessica jumped to her feet, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not Mom," she screamed. "I made a mistake, but I'm not like her." Lorraine stood too, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Don't you dare drag me into this. If anyone's to blame, it's the men in this family, always playing the victim while women are left to pick up the pieces." "Pick up the pieces?" Jessica's father shouted. "You tore them apart." Ethan watched in silence as the chaos unfolded, his initial satisfaction giving way to unease. He hadn't anticipated this level of raw emotion, or the bombshell about Jessica's mother. For the first time, he wondered if he'd underestimated just how deep the cracks in this family ran. "All right, enough," Ethan finally said, his voice commanding. "This isn't about your past. This is about Jessica and what she's done. So maybe instead of blaming each other, you can both focus on the mess she's made right here, right now." Jessica collapsed back into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Lorraine muttered something under her breath, while Jessica's father paced the room, shaking his head. Ethan stood there, his own emotions swirling as he realized the true depth of the wounds he'd just exposed. Jessica sat frozen for a moment, her face buried in her hands as tears streamed uncontrollably. She was trembling, unable to string together a single coherent word. The weight of the evidence, the accusations, and the shame crushed her completely. Her father, visibly shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief, finally broke the silence. "Jessica, how could you?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "You watched our family fall apart because of your mother's betrayal. You know what it did to me, to us. I caught her cheating, just like Ethan caught you now. I believed you'd never stoop to this. I thought you'd learn from our mistakes." Jessica's sobs grew louder, but before she could respond, Lorraine, her mother, cut in like a storm. "All right, that's enough," Lorraine snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. She moved closer to Jessica, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Jessica, sweetheart, calm down. Don't let these weak men upset you. Your husband's just as much of a failure as your father was." "What?" Ethan said, blinking in disbelief. He stood straighter, staring at Lorraine as if he'd misheard. "You heard me," Lorraine shot back, her gaze fierce. "If your wife cheated on you, that's your fault. You weren't giving her what she needed, emotionally, physically, or otherwise. What did you expect her to do? Sit around and suffer while you failed her?" Ethan's mouth opened, then shut again. He tried to process what he'd just heard, but Lorraine wasn't done. "Jessica, baby," Lorraine cooed, stroking her daughter's hair. "This isn't your fault. You're not to blame for seeking out what he clearly couldn't give you. And you, Ethan," she spat his name like venom, "maybe instead of humiliating my daughter, you should be looking in the mirror and asking yourself where you went wrong." Ethan's face darkened. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice low but steady. "You think her bringing another man into our house is my fault?" "Absolutely," Lorraine snapped. "You married a beautiful, intelligent woman, and you let her down. What did you expect? Fidelity from someone like Jessica? Please." "Oh, this is rich," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "You sound like you're justifying every terrible decision you ever made." Lorraine's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare compare me to you. I had my reasons, just like Jessica does." "And those reasons destroyed this family," Jessica's father bellowed, slamming his fist on the table. "You taught her nothing but selfishness and deceit, Lorraine. Don't you see that? You made her think this was okay." "I taught her to stand up for herself," Lorraine shot back, "to never settle for less than she deserves. And this is where that standing up has led her," her ex-husband yelled, gesturing to Jessica, who was now curled up in her chair, shaking with sobs. "Humiliation, betrayal, shame." The argument escalated, voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of accusations and bitterness. Lorraine hurled insults at her ex-husband, accusing him of being cold and unloving, while he fired back about her infidelity and its ripple effects. Ethan tried to cut in, but every time he opened his mouth, Lorraine would turn her venom on him, blaming him for Jessica's choices and painting him as a failure of a husband. Jessica, caught in the middle of the firestorm, seemed to shrink further and further into herself. Her cries were barely audible over the shouting match between her parents. Ethan finally snapped. "Enough!" he roared, slamming his hand on the table. "This isn't about your messed-up marriage or your excuses, Lorraine. This is about Jessica and what she did." "Typical," Lorraine sneered, "always blaming the woman." Ethan was about to retort when the sound of the doorbell cut through the chaos like a knife. Ethan rushed to the door, his heart pounding as the chaos in the dining room continued to simmer behind him. When he opened it, there stood Sarah, his lawyer, a tall, poised woman in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp navy suit that screamed professionalism. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said briskly, holding a folder in one hand. "But we had an appointment, Ethan." Ethan nodded, a little caught off guard. "Yeah, you're right. Come in." As he led Sarah into the dining room, the arguments immediately ceased. All eyes turned to the unfamiliar woman. Jessica's mother, Lorraine, narrowed her eyes, her suspicion palpable. Jessica, still trembling from the earlier confrontation, looked between Ethan and Sarah, her face paling. Sarah wasted no time. She set the folder on the table, cleared her throat, and addressed the room with the calm, collected tone of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Jessica," Sarah began, her gaze steady. "I'm Sarah Blake, Ethan's attorney. These are divorce papers. Ethan has decided to proceed with dissolving your marriage, effective immediately." Jessica's reaction was instantaneous. "What?" she shrieked, her voice breaking. She shot to her feet, nearly knocking over her chair. "I'm not signing anything." Lorraine, however, smirked. "Jessica, calm down," she said smoothly, standing as well. "This is a blessing in disguise. You don't need to stay married to a weakling and a failure like him." She gestured dismissively toward Ethan. "This will be the best decision of your life." Jessica's father groaned, burying his face in his hands. "For God's sake, Lorraine, not everything is a battle. The girl just destroyed her marriage, and you're cheering her on?" Lorraine ignored him, her focus on Sarah now. "We'll sign the papers," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Jessica, don't worry. I'll handle everything. Give me the documents, Ms. Blake." Sarah hesitated for a moment before sliding the folder toward Lorraine. "If you have any questions, my contact information is here." She placed a business card on top of the folder, her professional demeanor unshaken by the family drama unfolding before her. "Good," Lorraine said, grabbing the card. "I'll have my lawyer review this, and we'll get back to you in a few days." Jessica, still in shock, muttered, "Mom, Enough," Lorraine snapped. "Go pack your things. We're leaving this place." Sarah gave Ethan a polite nod. "I'll be in touch," she said before making a swift exit, clearly wanting to avoid getting dragged further into the mess. As the door clicked shut behind her, Lorraine turned her fiery attention back to the room. "This is exactly why men like you," she said, pointing at both Ethan and Jessica's father, "are incapable of holding a family together, always blaming the women for your own failures." "That's rich coming from you," Jessica's father retorted, his voice rising. "Your poison has ruined this family." Ignoring him, Lorraine grabbed Jessica by the arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. "Go on, Jessica. Pack your things. We're not staying another minute in this toxic house." Jessica hesitated, but under her mother's glare steeled herself. Within 10 minutes, they were dragging suitcases out the door. Jessica didn't look back, her face a mask of humiliation and defiance. Lorraine, however, made a point to glare at Ethan as they left. "You'll regret this, Ethan," she hissed. "You'll see." Ethan stood silently at the door, watching as they drove off into the night. The house, once buzzing with tension and chaos, now felt eerily quiet. Jessica's father remained seated, staring at the empty plate in front of him. After a long silence, he sighed heavily and looked up at Ethan. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I failed her as a father. I should have raised her better." Ethan shook his head. "You don't have to apologize. I didn't know how deep these issues went. I thought bringing you both here would help. I just wanted you to hear everything from me, not through gossip." Jessica's father nodded slowly. "It's better this way. But Ethan, don't let this poison your life. You did the right thing cutting her loose." Ethan smiled faintly. "Thanks. I'll make sure the divorce goes quickly and quietly." I don't want this turning into a circus or creating more trouble for your family." Jessica's father gave him a firm nod of approval. "Good man," he said before standing up. "Take care of yourself, Ethan. You deserve better." With that, he walked out, leaving Ethan alone in the now empty house. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Ethan exhaled deeply, finally letting himself feel the weight of what had just happened. The courtroom wasn't what Ethan had imagined. He'd pictured order, professionalism, and fairness. Instead, it felt like a battleground, with Lorraine leading the charge like a general hungry for chaos. Every day of the divorce proceedings was a new trial, not just legally, but emotionally. Lorraine's relentless attacks and Jessica's passive-aggressive participation made the experience more grueling than Ethan had anticipated. From the very start, Lorraine set the tone. She whispered to Jessica, sneered at Ethan, and made exaggerated claims about his character in court. "Your Honor," Lorraine declared on one occasion, standing as if she were a lawyer herself, "this man is not just an unfit husband. He's controlling, paranoid, and frankly, incapable of satisfying his wife's needs, financially or otherwise." Ethan's attorney, Sarah, shot her a sharp glare. "Objection, Your Honor. Unsubstantiated claims." The judge sighed, clearly irritated by Lorraine's antics. "Sustained. Mrs. Miller, please refrain from making personal attacks." But that didn't stop her. Lorraine coached Jessica to throw every accusation they could muster at Ethan. He was stingy, emotionally neglectful, and, the pièce de résistance, a borderline sociopath who used cameras to spy on his wife. Ethan, through it all, kept his cool. Sarah was a rock, systematically dismantling each baseless claim with calm precision. The footage of Jessica's infidelity was the cornerstone of their case, and it couldn't be refuted. Ethan's meticulous records and level-headed demeanor worked in his favor, while Lorraine's theatrics painted her and Jessica as desperate and vindictive. In the end, the judge ruled for a fair division of assets. Jessica didn't get the windfall Lorraine had promised her, and Ethan's financial stability remained intact. Lorraine's fury was palpable as the judge delivered the verdict. She muttered something under her breath about the system being rigged, but it was over. The marriage was legally dissolved. After the court adjourned, Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. "That was brutal," he muttered to Sarah. Sarah smirked, packing up her papers. "It's over now. You came out of this better than most." As Ethan left the courtroom, Lorraine made one last snide remark, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I hope you enjoy your freedom, Ethan. Too bad you couldn't satisfy my daughter. Pathetic and resentful impotent. Maybe that's why she looked elsewhere." Ethan paused for a moment, considering a retort, but then he shook his head and walked away. Lorraine's words were venomous, but they carried no weight. He wasn't going to let her bitterness dictate his life any longer. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind of gossip. Lorraine, true to form, spread rumors in their community about Ethan's supposed inadequacies as a husband. She painted him as a controlling miser who couldn't keep his wife happy. Ethan heard the whispers but didn't care. The truth was on his side, and anyone who believed Lorraine's lies wasn't worth his time. Instead, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He sold the house, too many memories, and moved into a modern apartment downtown. He threw himself into work, picking up new projects and reconnecting with colleagues he'd lost touch with during the marriage. Slowly, he began to feel like himself again. One evening, as Ethan sat on his balcony with a drink in hand, watching the city lights twinkle, he felt a deep sense of relief. The storm was over. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and chaos, but he'd come out the other side stronger. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to smile, not because of someone else, but because he was finally at peace.